We start in the mid-1950s with the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter that first flew at the height of the Cold War. Designed by the American aerospace company Lockheed Corporation under engineer Clarence, the aircraft was built for one primary purpose: speed. The United States Air Force wanted a high-performance interceptor capable of climbing quickly and destroying enemy bombers before they could threaten American airspace. To achieve this, the F-104 was given a powerful engine and an extremely small, thin wings that minimized drag. The result was one of the fastest aircraft of its era, capable of exceeding Mach 2 and reaching astonishing altitudes. On paper, the design looked brilliant. In practice, many pilots found it intimidating and unforgiving to fly. The tiny wings that gave the aircraft its incredible speed also meant it had very high landing speeds and very little margin for error. At low altitude, the aircraft could be especially dangerous, and a small mistake could quickly become catastrophic. Several pilots complained that the jet behaved more like a missile with a pilot attached than a conventional fighter. The aircraft's reputation became especially controversial in Europe. When countries such as Germany adopted the F-104 in large numbers during the 1960s, accident rates rose sharply. In the German Air Force alone, hundreds of aircraft were lost, and many pilots were killed during training and operational flights. These tragedies led to the aircraft earning the grim nickname Widowmaker, reflecting the fear many pilots and their families associated with it. Over time, improvements were introduced. Training programs were upgraded, avionics were modernized, and maintenance procedures were tightened. Later versions performed better, and accident rates eventually declined. Even so, the F-104 never completely escaped its reputation. From there, we arrive in the early jet age with the Vought F7U Cutlass, a fighter that looked unlike almost anything that had come before it. Developed by Vought for the United States Navy, the Cutlass was conceived in the late 40s when engineers were experimenting with bold new aerodynamic ideas. The aircraft abandoned the traditional tail entirely, relying instead on large swept wings and elevons for control. Twin-jet engines were buried deep inside the fuselage, while a very tall nose landing gear gave the aircraft its distinctive nose-high stance on the deck of an aircraft carrier. In theory, it was exactly what the Navy wanted: a modern carrier fighter capable of operating in the rapidly advancing world of jet combat. In practice, it proved far more troublesome. The early jet engines simply did not produce enough thrust for the airframe. Takeoffs from carriers were tense affairs, and pilots sometimes found themselves struggling to gain altitude even after leaving the deck. Mechanical failures were also frequent. Hydraulic problems could appear without warning, occasionally leaving pilots with limited control authority. For an aircraft that had to operate in the demanding environment of carrier aviation, this was a serious weakness. Landing the Cutlass would be even more unnerving. The long nose gear, designed to help with the angle of attack during takeoff, carried enormous loads during carrier recoveries. There were several incidents where the gear collapsed, sometimes violently. Pilots quickly learned that the aircraft had little tolerance for mistakes. At low speeds, it could be unstable, and any loss of power made the situation worse. Attempts were made to improve the design with upgraded engines and modifications to the systems, but the aircraft's reputation had already been established. By the late 50s, the Navy replaced it with more dependable fighters such as the Vought F-8 Crusader. And then there's the early Boeing 737 MAX. If you know one modern airliner controversy, this is the one. The aircraft was developed by Boeing as the latest evolution of the long-running Boeing 737 family, an aircraft that had already been flying successfully since the late 60s. Airlines wanted better fuel efficiency without the cost of training pilots on a completely new airplane. Boeing's answer was the 737 MAX, fitted with larger, more efficient engines and updated avionics while keeping the same basic airframe. But those larger engines created a aerodynamic problem. Mounted higher and farther forward on the wing, they could cause the aircraft's nose to pitch upward under certain conditions. To counter this, Boeing introduced a new automated system called MCAS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. In theory, it would quietly push the nose down if the aircraft approached a stall, making the MAX handle similarly to earlier 737 models. In practice, the system proved deeply controversial. Many pilots later said they were barely aware the system even existed. Training materials had mentioned little about it, and in some cases, crews only learned its details after accidents began making headlines. In 2018 and 2019, two catastrophic crashes involving the Lion Air Flight 610 Boeing 737 MAX and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 Boeing 737 MAX killed hundreds of people and triggered a worldwide grounding of the craft. Investigations revealed that faulty sensor data could cause MCAS to repeatedly force the aircraft's nose downward, leaving pilots struggling to understand what the airplane was doing. For many aviators, the issue was not just the system itself, but how little information they had been given about it. The response was sweeping. Aviation authorities, including the Federal Aviation Administration, required software changes, improved sensor logic, and far more extensive pilot training. After nearly 2 years, the aircraft returned to service. Next comes the Brewster F2A Buffalo, one of the early American naval fighters of the Second World War. Developed by Brewster Aeronautical Corporation in the late 30s, it was actually a fairly modern design for its time. The Buffalo was a stubby all-metal monoplane with retractable landing gear, an enclosed cockpit, and a radial engine. When it first flew, it even impressed evaluators from the United States Navy, which adopted it as one of its primary carrier fighters just before the war began. The aircraft seemed promising. It was compact, relatively easy to manufacture, and carried a respectable armament for the period. Early production models performed reasonably well in testing and looked like a step forward compared with older biplane fighters still in service at the time. But the Buffalo's reputation changed quickly once it entered combat. As additional armor, fuel, and equipment were added, the aircraft became heavier and less agile. Pilots soon found that the fighter struggled to keep up with more advanced opponents, particularly the highly maneuverable Mitsubishi A6M0 used by the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. In dogfights, the Buffalo often felt sluggish and slow to climb, leaving pilots at a serious disadvantage. American pilots who flew the aircraft in the early Pacific battles were especially critical of it. They complained that it lacked power, handled poorly under combat loads, and could become difficult to control during intense maneuvering. Maintenance crews also faced reliability issues that made the situation worse during demanding operations in tropical climates. Yet the story was not entirely one-sided. In the hands of well-trained pilots flying lighter versions of the aircraft, the Buffalo could perform better than its reputation suggested. The Finnish Air Force, for example, used the fighter with notable success against Soviet aircraft during the war. Even so, the Buffalo's shortcomings were clear. It was soon replaced in American service by more capable fighters such as the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. While it began as a promising design, the Buffalo became remembered by many pilots as an aircraft that simply could not keep up with the rapidly changing demands of wartime aerial combat. Then came the Havilland Comet, the world's first commercial jet airliner. Developed by the British manufacturer de Havilland in the late 1940s, it represented a dramatic leap forward in air travel. Compared to the propeller-driven airliners of the era, the Comet was faster, quieter, and able to fly at much higher altitudes. When it entered service with BOAC in 1952, passengers were suddenly crossing continents in a sleek pressurized jet that seemed to belong to the future. At first, the aircraft performed beautifully. Pilots praised its smooth handling and the absence of the vibration that came from piston engines. For a brief period, the Comet appeared to give Britain a commanding lead in the emerging jet airliner market. But within a few years, a series of mysterious disasters began to occur. Several Comets broke apart in mid-air during routine flights without warning. The accidents shocked the aviation world. Aircraft that had taken off normally simply disappeared, with wreckage later found scattered across the sea. Investigators eventually discovered that the problem was not pilot error or engine failure, but something far more subtle. The aircraft's pressurized fuselage was suffering from metal fatigue caused by repeated cycles of cabin pressurization and depressurization. Weaknesses formed around stress points in the structure, particularly near the square-shaped passenger windows. Over time, those cracks could grow until the fuselage failed catastrophically. For pilots, the uncertainty was deeply unsettling. The Comet was still pleasant to fly, but the knowledge that the aircraft itself might fail in flight cast a long shadow over its early reputation. Airlines grounded the fleet while engineers searched for answers. The solution required a major redesign. Later versions of the Comet were built with thicker fuselage skin, stronger structural reinforcement, and rounded windows that distributed stress far more evenly. These changes made the aircraft much safer. Even so, the damage to its reputation had already been done, and newer jets such as the Boeing 707 soon dominated the market. Then came the Convair B-58 Hustler, a bomber that pushed the limits of speed and technology during the Cold War. Developed by Convair for the United States Air Force, the B-58 first flew in 1956 and entered service at the start of the 60s. It was the world's first operational bomber, capable of sustained supersonic flight. With 4 powerful jet engines and a sleek delta wing, the aircraft could exceed Mach 2 while carrying nuclear weapons deep into enemy territory. At the time, it represented the cutting edge of strategic aviation. The aircraft was built for one very specific mission. In the early years of the Cold War, American planners believed that speed was the best defense against increasingly sophisticated air defenses. The B-58 would race toward its target at extreme altitude and velocity, drop its payload, and escape before interceptors or missiles could react. But operating such a machine proved extraordinarily demanding. The Hustler required a crew of 3, each seated in a separate cockpit compartment. The aircraft's systems were complex and unforgiving, and even routine operations demanded careful coordination. Pilots often remarked that the B-58 was less like flying a bomber and more like managing a high-speed experimental aircraft. Takeoffs and landings required precise handling, and the aircraft's high performance left little room for mistakes. Accident rates reflected the difficulty. A significant number of B-58s were lost during training and testing, and several crews were killed in the process. Many pilots respected the aircraft's capabilities, but admitted that it demanded constant attention and discipline. In the air, it could be thrilling, but it was never considered easy or forgiving to fly. Engineers introduced improvements over time, including upgraded escape capsules that replaced earlier ejection seats and better training procedures for crews. These changes improved survivability, but the fundamental challenge of operating such a fast and complex bomber never truly disappeared. By the early 70s, the Air Force retired the B-58, replacing it with aircraft better suited to the evolving strategic environment. So do you believe some aircraft are destined to be tamed by pilots, or are certain designs just too dangerous to love? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this video helped you see how engineers and pilots push the limits of aviation, make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories behind the world's most infamous and challenging aircraft.